introduce our speaker tonight, Yossi Klein Halevi. I don't know if you've read his books, the 2013 book, Like Dreamers, about the paratroopers who retook the Kotel, or if you've read the 2018 book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, where he tries to communicate through this book our story, perhaps from those who've never heard it from the source. Because you don't let someone else tell your story. You tell your story. And don't let someone else tell you someone else's story. Hear it from them directly. And so that's all I really have to say. So let me please bring up our speaker tonight, Yossi Klein Halevi.
Thank you, Alan. When I asked Yossi if he could come to town and if he could give a lecture, he said, I'd much rather be in dialogue with you. And so that's what we're going to do. He's going to speak, but I've got a number of questions for him. And I thought we could start with the personal, if that's okay. Sure. These are intense times in many ways. And I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about your spiritual practice. How do you stay focused and grounded spiritually in intense times? And does your spiritual practice in any way inform your peace building work over the decades?
So first of all, good evening, everyone. And Rav Shmuley, I'm so delighted to be engaged with you in dialogue. And I so much appreciate what you do and what you stand for in the Jewish community. So thank you. And Rabbi Green, thank you for the hospitality. And Alan, thank you for those really beautiful words about your father and for bringing me here. So I really appreciate the question because it's usually one that I'm not asked about. And my spiritual life is private. It's not a secret, but it's something that one tends not to speak about. And my day job, and I guess my evening and night job as well, is really dealing with Israel and the Jewish people. And so I don't generally have the opportunity to speak about my inner life. But for me, being a seeker is really the core of my life. It's what makes everything else possible. And being a seeker means really being part of the vast mystical tradition, which is common to all the great faiths. And in Judaism, we have a very, very deep mystical tradition, which was largely displaced by the 19th century, by the emergence of secularism in the Jewish people, and then the Holocaust and the mass migrations of the Jewish people. I recently read that 90% of Jews today are descendant, or 90% of Jews today live in places different from their great-grandparents, which is perhaps unprecedented in Jewish history, maybe not since the expulsion 2,000 years ago. So there were all of these upheavals that have really displaced the Jewish mystical tradition, but it's very deep in Judaism. And I've been fortunate, really blessed to have teachers along the way. I don't think you can do this without teachers. And I have a strong meditation practice that's based on Kabbalistic techniques, on Hasidic teachings. And there is a movement that I was part of in Jerusalem to revive these techniques. And I believe that we are on the verge of a major religious renaissance in Judaism. I think that October 7th will quicken that process. But in some ways, we're long overdue because of what the last 100 years of Jewish history has been like. And so what I try to do in my own practice, which is admittedly very unconventional, I don't really know how to situate myself on the religious map. I belong to, in some ways, all the denominations, and in some ways, none of them. And I think there are many, actually, many like me. So
Very nice. So you've argued that October 7th marks the end of the post-Holocaust era. And what I understood you to be arguing there is that post-Holocaust, two great visions were achieved, two dreams we couldn't have imagined. One was that a weak, displaced people around the world could actually return to the land and develop sovereignty and rebuild a renaissance of Jewish culture and society. And the other was that Jews in the diaspora could actually be secure and safe and prosper. And both of those were achieved in a very significant way. And I understand that in October 7th shattered in many ways those two visions. One, that the state of Israel was capable of protecting its citizens properly. And it wasn't a superpower that attacked Israel. It was terrorists on tractors, as you called them, terrorists on tractors. And in the diaspora, the waning of Jewish power, American Jewish power, and attacks from the far right of Christian nationalists and white supremacists from the far left who have no tolerance for the Jewish story either, and certain segments, and from radical Islamists. And so tell us a little bit about this post-Holocaust era and how you understand this moment that we're in.
So first of all, the post-Holocaust era is, I think, the most extraordinary period in Jewish history. And that's a very big statement, talking about 4,000 years. But we never went from the abyss to the peak moment of Jewish history in one generation. And we did that from 1945 to now. And even with October 7th, it's still the most extraordinary transformation in Jewish history. There was a rabbi, I'm sure you knew, Rabbi Amital, who was really one of Israel's great rabbis, a powerful voice for religious and political moderation. He himself was a Holocaust survivor. And he said once that in the far future, if archaeologists, if the story of the Jewish people was forgotten, the story of the Jews in the 20th century was forgotten, and archaeologists came across evidence of the Holocaust and of the creation of Israel, they would naturally assume that centuries separated these two events. And so what we've come to take as a given of our lives is the most extraordinary Jewish story in history. And October 7th went a partial way to upending that post-Holocaust achievement. And I say partially because I don't believe that any act, no matter how severe, any setback, can undo that achievement. And that achievement stands. That's the foundation on which the contemporary Jewish people rests. The two flags on the bima is really, it's something that when I was growing up, and I grew up, as you can hear from my accent, I grew up in the US, and I always took that for granted. It was almost a cliche, the two flags in the bima. And it was only when I got older that I began to appreciate the deep intuition of the generation of Jews who decided to put those two secular symbols at the most sacred geographical point of the synagogue. And there's something very strange about that. Why are there these two secular symbols flanking the Torah ark? And I think that the intuition that that generation had was that these are the two symbols of the Jewish healing from the Holocaust. We would not have healed without the convergence of, or the emergence of a sovereign Jewish state and the simultaneous emergence of a self-confident and powerful Jewish community, which happened only after the Holocaust. And it didn't really begin happening, in my experience, until the 60s, 70s. The American Jewish community, I remember growing up from the 1960s, was still quite insecure. And so something changed over these last decades, and we began to own the Jewish success story. We began to own our healing. And what is so disorienting about October 7th is, as you put it, Shmuley, it hits at precisely our two great successes. The failure of the state of Israel to save 1,000 Jews within the borders of a sovereign Jewish state. We are a country that sent commandos halfway across Africa to rescue 100 Jews who were at Entebbe airport. And we couldn't save 1,000 Jews within our own borders. So this is a shock that's going to take us generations in Israel to process. And I don't know if we ever will fully overcome that shock. And you here, I think, have gone through a kind of a parallel experience of deep insecurity. There's a question mark. And at the Hartman Institute, where I sit, we developed a curriculum a couple of years ago, before October 7th, and the title was From No Home to Two Homes, Israel and America. And this is really the first place in the diaspora where Jews felt fully at home, fully accepted. And post-October 7th, there's a bit of a question mark on both of those experiences of being fully at home.
So I know you're writing a book now, The Wisdom of Survival. And I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on what you think has enabled Jews to survive over the millennia, and why does that matter for this moment? In particular, with Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day this week, how do you think we should have certain sensitivities towards how we discuss the Shoah given this moment?
So the book that I'm working on really focuses on the post-Holocaust era. And it begins the day after the Shoah, 1945. It actually begins, I'll let you in on the opening of the book. It begins with my father, who was a survivor, who was hiding in a pit in a forest with two friends, emerging from the earth. And so that becomes the metaphor for the resurrection of the Jewish people. It's my personal metaphor, but I use it as a collective metaphor. And the question of the book is the question that I raised a moment ago, which is really, how did we do it? How did we go from that to the Jewish reality that we all grew up in? How did we go from total powerlessness to the peak moment of Jewish power in our history, for which Jews should never apologize? We should not apologize for our power. It's complicated. Having power, using power, especially fighting the kind of enemies we're fighting, is complicated. American Jews should never have to apologize for their so-called privilege. This is a community that a few generations ago were in tenements. We don't have to apologize for the success story of American Jewry and for the success story of Israel. So the book celebrates that success. It frankly celebrates the Jewish return to power and our ability to defend ourselves. But it asks the question, which you raised, how did we do it? And the reason that I'm focusing on the modern period, so I'm not really grappling with the question of how did we survive for millennia. There have been other books dealing with that question, and very little attention, surprisingly, placed on this achievement of survival. How did we overcome the Shoah? How did we overcome our brokenness? And the argument of the book is that we did it by going for broke. And by that I mean that for 2,000 years, we carried an absurd dream, really a fantasy that this most powerless people that's spread all around the world is somehow going to be able to not only return to its lost homeland, but gather all the exiles from all around the world and figure out a way of restoring sovereignty and defending itself, which of course is exactly what happened. And the fact that we went for that dream immediately after the Holocaust, and in some sense in response to the Holocaust, was, I think, an expression of a very deep intuition. Now, of course, Zionism did not arise because of the Holocaust, and the state of Israel does not exist because of the Holocaust. I think it's very important for us to emphasize. The state of Israel exists because Jews have longed for it for 2,000 years. And of course, a majority of Jews in Israel today come from families whose origins are in the Middle East, who didn't even experience the Shoah. But I'm speaking in some way more spiritually, that there was an intuition in 1945 that we have just experienced the greatest nightmare in our history. And the only way to overcome that is by answering it, by fulfilling our greatest dream. And that was the moment when Zionism stopped being a minority within the Jewish people and became the consensus position of the overwhelming majority of Jews.
Okay, so I want to push back on the idea of the celebration of power. Because on the one hand, I think of the words of my teacher, Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, who says, post-Holocaust, it is a sin to be powerless. And how could we not celebrate a powerless people gaining power and attempting to use that for noble endeavors? On the other hand, there are those who have gone too far,
Right.
Drunk with power.
Right.
Judaism has become about power, whether you call it Israelism or stateism, that it's replaced Judaism. The goal of a Jewish identity is now power. And that's a dark side of the celebration of power. And I wonder how you see that playing out. And what do you think about those whose primary Jewish identity is Zionist identity or is nationalist identity?
So I think you're right, Shmuley. And the way that I phrased it, and maybe I needed to rephrase the way I phrased it, was celebrating our return to power, our reclamation of power, which means celebrating our ability to emerge from powerlessness. That's what I celebrate. And in terms of our power, I don't celebrate power. I'm grateful for power. I'm grateful for our ability to meet October 7th with October 8th, that we were able to turn that around. And you're certainly right that what we're facing in Israel and in certain parts of the diaspora as well is a confusion of how the rabbis always understood power, which is power is a necessity. You don't apologize for power. If you have to use power, do not be squeamish, but you also don't revel in power. And that's a very delicate balance that the rabbis courageously upheld. Of course, it was easier when it was all theoretical. The rabbis had no power, and they were in a way engaged in a very moving conversation about power for a people that had lost power, but with the anticipation that one day we would reclaim power and we would have their wisdom to draw on. One of the ironies that I find is the people that I hear you refer to in Israel in particular, without mentioning names, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the camp of the far right. These are people who are ostensibly Orthodox Jews, rabbinic Jews, but I actually think they hate the rabbinic tradition. I think they hate the rabbis because the rabbis were a voice of relentless moderation. And what I see happening in parts of the Israeli Orthodox community is an outbreak of longing for the biblical era, the pre-rabbinic era, when Jews produced Samson and the judges and warrior kings, when we were in the vigor of our uncomplicated and sometimes amoral youth. And I understand that longing. And I had that when I was younger. And it brought me to those places as well politically. When I was a teenager, I was very much part of the far right. But what is playing out in Israel today is a very dangerous, implicit rejection of the rabbinic tradition by those claiming to uphold it.
So picking up on your youth and what you might describe as your youthful extremism or radicalism, can you talk a little bit about your relationship with Rabbi Meir Kahane, and that movement, and what moved you out of it, and what you see happening now is a revival of this Kahane spirit?
Do you all remember Meir Kahane? So when I was a teenager, I was in the Jewish Defense League. I grew up in Brooklyn, and in my neighborhood, the JDL headquarters was conveniently a few blocks away from where I lived, but I would have joined anyway. And the attraction that I had to Kahane, and that many in my generation had to him, was that he was the voice of Jewish rage, of post-Holocaust Jewish rage. And what I couldn't bear growing up was the absence of Jewish rage. And if you'll recall, those of you who will recall, the American Jewish community of the 1960s, it was a community that was focused on finding its place in American society and was afraid to express rage. And Kahane came along and said, hey, this is the 60s. Every other aggrieved minority is raging in the streets, and where are we? So for me, he was the Jewish Black Panthers, the Jewish SDS, for those of you who remember the reference. And the JDL was different in some ways from what Kahane later reestablished in Israel. The JDL was not concerned with expelling the Palestinians, which became Kahane's central policy goal in Israel. Kahane became an extreme messianist, an apocalyptic messianist, and he was not that when I knew him in New York. But the similarities, the connection between the JDL and the radical movement that he established in Israel was a love of violence. And I used to joke that that JDL's motto should be, why solve any problem peacefully when you can solve it with violence? And that really was, violence is a first resort. That was, and one can look at, you could go into the whole psychological background of why the generation immediately after the Shoah needed that sense of affirmation of our ability to be violent. But what Kahane did in Israel was bring in a level of violence, of extreme violence, which was completely unnecessary. Israelis did not need Meir Kahane to learn how to defend themselves. We didn't need the JDL, we had the IDF. And Kahane poisoned much of the right. What we see happening today with this terrible government, this is the most extreme government in Israel's history, is in a way the belated vindication of Kahane. And it depresses me to no end to realize that however inadvertently, my friends and I were part of helping create one of the most monstrous movements in contemporary Jewry.
Wow. So with the passing of the Pope yesterday,
From Mayor Kahana to the Pope, how do we segue?
Yeah, I'm sure he'd be honored. Yeah. So
They're both men of the cloth.
it leaves me thinking about the next stage of Abrahamic faith relations. What will our new relationship be with a new Pope? What will our relationship be with the Muslim world? For those who don't know Yossi well, he's spent decades working on Muslim-Jewish relations. What does the grassroots interfaith peace-building movement look like now, post-October 7th? And I can share here locally what some folks know and some don't, which is that VBN was doing Muslim-Jewish dialogue for about a decade. I'm talking 100 Muslims in a room, 100 Jews in the room, deep conversations, theology, really building bridges. October 7th happens. I reach out to the imams to get together, and no response. I said, let's just have some shalom, let's just have lunch. No response. I'm at an event with one. I said, please, let's just talk. And he says, I can't be seen as aligned with Jews. Not even with Israel, but with Jews. What is your experience in Muslim peace building work? And I want to just name what I see as a problem on both sides. I see a real problem on the right that is often Islamophobic, often not concerned with Muslim rights, wants to say the Quran is all evil. I see a problem on the left that is unable to name the problems of radical Islamism, that is unable to talk about fundamentalist Islam and the tens of millions, hundreds of millions who support things like Hamas. Why can't we stand up for the rights of Muslim people and also speak about the great global evil of the rise of fundamentalist Islam? And so we've lost that nuance, and I'm at a loss on how to continue peace building work in this regard, even though I'll continue trying. And I would love to hear what your work looks like now on that, and where you've thought.
I think you put it really well in terms of how the Jewish community plays out our relationship with the Muslim world. Post-October 7th, I'm in a very different place than I've been in the last 20 years. I've devoted a large part of my life, as you have, to outreach, and I did so partly for spiritual reasons, but more for very pragmatic and self-interested Jewish reasons, which is that there are 1.5 billion of them and 15 million of us. And the physical safety of the Jewish people in the 21st century will in part be determined by the nature of our relationship with Muslim communities. That's obvious in Israel, where we live in a Muslim expanse. But it's certainly true, increasingly true for the diaspora as well. And you just experienced what you did over the last year and a half here, especially on campuses, as in part an assault by large parts of the American Muslim community on your children. That's really what happened over the last year and a half. And when you said, Shmuley, about defending Muslim rights, and I certainly still believe in that, but I would make one exception. I don't believe that it is the place of the Jewish community to stand up for Muslim leaders who are not American citizens of the campus encampments. Let others stand up for them, and I hope that as the ADL and the AJC both put it in their statements, that there'll be due process of law, that this issue needs to be solved by the courts, but it is not the place. When I see Jews speaking out for Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia, after he led the campaign that turned Jewish kids at Columbia into pariahs. And I spoke at Columbia. I met with Jewish students there last spring, and it was really depressing to see how afraid they were, how demoralized. I asked kids at Columbia, the Jewish kids, if you knew then what you know now, would you have come to Columbia? Every Jewish kid in the room said no. And that's on Mahmoud Khalil and his friends. So yes, there needs to be due process of law. Let the ACLU defend him. It's not the place of Jews or Jewish organizations. This is not our. So
Okay, so
I just have to say that.
let's come back to campuses. We'll come back to it. But if you'll talk about your own relationships with Muslims and what's happened there since post October 7th, we'll come back to campus.
So my relationship, my work with Muslim Jewish relations really had two components. One was work in Israel with Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, Palestinians who are under occupation, and with the American Muslim community. At the Hartman Institute, I was the co-director of the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which brought groups of young emerging Muslim American leaders to the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem to study Judaism, Israel, and Zionism. And there was no program like that. Hartman doesn't do dialogue, we do education. And we brought young Muslim leaders to study Judaism and Israel. And we graduated something like 170 people over the last 10 years from the program. The post-October 7th reality has been very sobering. I have certainly kept my relationships with my primary Muslim partners, but I've lost a lot of partners since. What I used to say, and we've talked about this, what I used to say before October 7th is that I have no preconditions about whom I will sit with in the Muslim community. I don't care what you've said. I don't care if you're a Holocaust denier. I don't care if you say that Israel has to be destroyed. If you're willing to sit with me and hear what I have to say, I'll sit with you and hear what you have to say. Because our two communities are at war. And if you're going to be willing to sit with me, I'll sit with you. And I believe me, I've heard it all. I've heard the worst things you can imagine, and some surprisingly beautiful things as well. And that was my commitment to Muslim-Jewish relations. October 7th has changed the parameters. I will not engage with October 7th deniers, celebrants, minimizers. I have ground rules now of who I will engage with. And that's very hard for me because it really changes something very basic in what has been an essential part of my work all these years. But I think that the dignity of the Jewish people requires a certain minimal red line. So when your contact said, I can't be seen with Jews now, my response is, I will not be seen with Muslims who failed us on October 7th.
Yeah. Going back to campus, about a third of Jewish students on campus report that they feel they must hide their Jewishness. A study last year showed. ADL Today said that anti-Semitic incidents on campus rose over 80% on campus since last year. This was the fourth year in a row that it broke all records. Can you reflect on what you think is happening there? And as you touched on already, the response of the Trump administration to universities with deportations and pulling of funding. I know you think that Jews shouldn't be at the center of pushing back, but do you think that making that about anti-Semitism is ultimately good for the Jews?
So, you spoke earlier about how the left wing of the Jewish community and the right wing relate both in very inadequate ways to the question of Muslim-Jewish relations. So what I find playing out in the left-right divide in the Jewish community over this particular issue, over Trump's pushback or assault, whatever language you want to use, on campuses, is also problematic on both sides. So, for example, well, I'll take it a step back. What I think is happening here is a very strange kind of echo of a Jewish situation in medieval times, and it's really strange to see this playing out in some sense in America today. And I'm thinking specifically about when Jews in medieval times would seek safety with a local baron from the mob. And the local baron had his own interests in offering safety to the Jews. He wanted them to be the moneylenders. He had other needs. He would heavily tax the Jews. And so it was in his financial interest to make sure that the mob wouldn't slaughter the Jews. But the relationship was very uncertain and very fickle. Sometimes a baron would extend protection. Sometimes there would be protection, but then it would be rescinded. And that's the very strange model that I think about when I'm thinking about Trump and the universities. What happened in the last year and a half is that the liberal tradition in American society, and especially the universities who were supposed to uphold the liberal tradition, betrayed the Jewish people. And so now you have the baron stepping in. And the baron probably doesn't care about us in the way that I don't think he cares about anything but the baron. And so some Jews, understandably, if perhaps short-sightedly, I don't know, but understandably, are seeking protection of the baron. On the right-wing side of this debate, the right-wing American Jews understand that the demonstrators, the campus demonstrators, were not innocent human rights protesters, young people speaking their minds, but an anti-Jewish mob that turned Jewish students into pariahs. But they don't understand who the baron is. They think the baron is their friend. On the left-wing side, there are Jews who understand who the baron is very well and are warning us, don't trust this guy. And they're right, don't trust him. You're going to pay a price for throwing your lot in with him. Right now, he's going after the universities. He's going to walk away from us, and we're going to be left holding the blame for the assault on the universities. They get that right on the left. What they don't get right is the nature of the demonstrators. They don't see the mob for what it is. One of the left-wing Jewish newspapers in America recently published a letter by Mahmoud Khalil, a letter from jail, as if this is, Martin Luther King writing from Montgomery prison. And really, a Jewish newspaper, you're going to publish, and give this guy a platform? This is the mob. And yes, okay, Trump is the baron, but don't lose sight of the mob.
So let's turn to the war. We talk about October 7th, we talk about hostages, but it's easy to forget for some people in America that we're still in the midst of the largest and most brutal war in Israel's history, Jewish people's history, maybe. I don't know about that, but
I would say since the 1948.
So, okay, fine, good.
Which was still a little bit longer than this, but not by much.
Okay, so people read the news, and many people don't know how to understand it. And some people read news that reports the IDF has been reckless in the war in Gaza, bombing medics and children and hospitals and schools and tens of thousands of people killed, and feel shame. They feel shame that this is what has become of Jewish power. They feel shame when people, equate the IDF and this attempt to other brutal regimes in history. Others read news and commentary that tells them this has been the most morally conscious effort to beat a terror regime, and has taken great sensitivities and great lengths to conduct an impossible war, to minimize casualties. And how do you make sense of this different reporting and this different commentary, and how are people to make sense of all these disparities of understanding and facts on the ground?
So do I have about 2 hours? So I'll try to really sum it up in 5 minutes. Okay. I don't think that either of those descriptions that you read are necessarily useful. For sure, we are not an army that is seeking to kill civilians. The IDF does not deliberately kill civilians. Have we taken all the precautions that we have in the past to protect civilians? The answer is no. And part of the reason for that is the nature of this war. On October 8th, Israeli society had a decision to make. We all knew we had to go into Gaza, but what is going to be the nature of this war? Is it going to be more or less like the other mini wars between Israel and Hamas? We fought 3 mini wars between 2009 and October 7th. And those mini wars were intended to deter Hamas from firing rockets into Israel, but the goal was not to destroy the regime. On October 8th, the entirety of Jewish Israeli society, virtually the entirety, and I'm saying Jewish Israeli society because Arab Israeli society works differently, but from left to center to right, almost every Israeli Jew agreed on October 8th that this war has to be different. This has to be a total war to destroy Hamas. We've never fought that kind of war before. Now, when we decided that, we knew what this war was going to look like. The reason we knew that is because Gaza is not an unknown for Israelis. Anyone who has served in the army in the last 30, 40 years, especially in a combat unit, has served in Gaza. So we knew what this war was going to. We knew this was going to be Israel's most brutal war by far. And then if you factor in the way that Hamas fights this, embedded in civilian populations, deliberately using hospitals, schools, neighborhoods as shields, and to say nothing of the hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. No army has ever had to fight this kind of war before. So objectively, the IDF has faced booby-trapped homes, apartments. Thousands of houses are booby-trapped in Gaza. You never hear about this. But a unit that goes into a house first needs to check for booby traps. And so on that level, there was an understanding among Israelis that we are going to be seeing sights that we haven't seen before. And one of the really telling details of Israel at war over the last year and a half is that there have been almost no demonstrations against the morality of the war. There were demonstrations every day in Israel to bring the government down, to have new elections, to prioritize the hostages over bringing down Hamas. But we're not demonstrating against the morality of the war. No demonstrations in Israel, which is extraordinary if you think about it, because this is by far the ugliest war that Israel has fought, and yet the Israeli left signed on to this war no less than the center and the right. And so this is our war. But it doesn't fully answer the question, because there's another element here, and that is the element of rage. When you send in a cross-section of Israeli society, which is the IDF, right? We talk about the IDF as a people's army, which means you get anybody and everybody. Some people will be more moral, some people will be less moral. There'll be a few who are psychopaths. You're getting the whole range of society. And when you send a cross-section of your society into Gaza on immediately after October 7th, in the state of rage that we were all in and we're still in, then you're going to have the kinds of incidents, and I believe there's still incidents rather than a policy or a trend. You're going to have the kind of incidents which will range from recklessness, soldiers who are not going to pay particularly close attention, to some very rare incidents of war crimes. Every war in Israel, every war anywhere has had war crimes. I believe that those war crimes, including in this war, are few and far between, but more than what we've had in the past. And it will be coming out in the coming months, and it must come out. But at the same time, I adamantly uphold the necessity of Israel fighting this worst war in our history.
So it's hard to go from Yeush to Tikva, from despair to hope. Because never in my lifetime have I had a sense of despair, moments of despair like I've had in the last year and a half. But if we turn the conversation towards the potential for hope for a moment, the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Israel have both said that this is not a time to talk about a two-state solution. Do you still hold out a vision as such? And do you still have hope for coexistence for Muslims and Jews, coexistence for Palestinians and Israelis? And if so, like, where would you find such a hope?
Shmuley, I have to tell you, I think that this is my favorite public event that I've done, because we haven't mentioned the Prime Minister of Israel till now. And that's an enormous relief. Really, how amazing. I'm obsessed, and I lose sleep over this government. And we've had a respite. So thank you. Thank you. So in terms of hope, I would say there are two issues here. One is internal, the other is external. Internal is the nature of Israeli society. And so, yes, let's talk about the Prime Minister. I believe we are in the grips of a man who once really cared about the country and was once a devoted public servant, a leader that I have great respect for. But since his legal complications has placed himself front and center to the exclusion of the national interest. And during war, that is catastrophic. He continues to divide, tears the country apart when a genuine leader should be bringing us together. He is trying to destroy key institutions in Israeli society, whether it's the courts or the Shabak, the Shin Bet, because these are all institutions that he feels are not loyal to him personally, and they're not, and they shouldn't be. There is no personal loyalty to the Prime Minister. There's loyalty to the state. And Israeli society today is deeply, deeply divided during war. But what gives me hope is what happened to us on October 8th. We pivoted from the lowest moment of our schism, which was October 6th, when the country was tearing itself apart, instantly to one of the peak moments of national unity in Israel's history. And what that showed, what that proved we proved to ourselves that we still have the instincts of self-preservation and the possibility of coming together as a people. We still have the instincts of people. And so October 8th is what fills me with hope. And when this war is over, Israeli society is going to have to make a choice. Do we go back to October 6th, or do we opt for October 8th? Most Israelis, and you see this in all the polls, want October 8th. And this is a government of October 6th. This is a government of divisiveness. And every poll since October 8th has shown that this government will lose resoundingly if elections were held today. So that gives me real hope for Israeli society internally. In terms of the region, and I'm not, before I answer your question about a Palestinian state, I want to broaden the question, which is Israel's place in the Middle East. The most significant foreign policy event in decades for Israel, from my perspective, was the Abraham Accords. And the reason I say that is because it was the first treaty, the first peace agreement between Israel and Arab countries that was premised on normalization. The Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, the Jordanian-Israeli peace agreement were glorified ceasefires. They were important, but there was no component of normalization. There was no people-to-people relationship. The goal of the Abraham Accords is normalization. If the Saudis join the Accords, and it will not happen under this government, because this is not a peace government in any sense. God willing, the next government, then we are in a new Middle East where Israel is conceivably making peace with the Sunni world. Now, the conflict was never only, or maybe even primarily, Israel and the Palestinians. That was an important component of the conflict. But for many decades, certainly the conflict that I knew growing up with, was the Sunni world's war, the Arab world, Sunni world's war against Israel. And the Sunni-Israeli war is ending. And this is an extraordinary moment in the history of Israel. It is being replaced by the Shiite-Israeli war, which is a very serious war in itself. And of course, the Palestinian-Israeli, the Palestinians are Sunnis, and that war is continuing. But my hope is, and this is to come to your question, that if we succeed in a regional peace agreement, that the Palestinians will have a place in that future Middle East. And it may not be quite the Palestinian state that they were hoping for, that they would have gotten had they said yes at various times along the way. Things happen, attitudes change. There will not be anywhere near the kind of political sovereignty or military sovereignty that the Palestinian state would have gotten under Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton. There's going to be, whatever happens, there will be a very strong Israeli security presence in the West Bank for the next generation. And that is a direct consequence of October 7th. So I don't know if that makes me an optimist by American standards. By Israeli standards, it makes me almost utopian.
Wow. Well, I'll ask you one more question and then we'll open it up. My colleague Isaac is going to walk with a mic, and also our friends on Zoom. I will be getting those questions by text. So what's your read on what's happening in diaspora Israel relations, American Jewish and Israeli relations? There was already a drifting apart prior to October 7th. I suspect in most of our families, we have a family member who feels more robustly Jewish, more connected to their Jewish identity post October 7th, and a family member who wants more distance from the Jewish identity.
It's a great way to put
it. Because of this experience. Yeah. And we don't have the data yet, at least I don't have the data yet, as to what this means in 5 years or 10 years about American Jewish commitment and identity for young Jews in particular. There's also a divide on politics. Large segments of Israelis who hated President Obama because of the Iran deal and other factors, and who have loved or praised President Trump because of Abraham Accords or other factors. And there's a political divide going on there as well. What's your read on how Israelis are understanding this moment in the diaspora? And of those growing divides and solidarity.
So my sense of, and again, this is more anecdotal than scientific, of Israeli changing attitudes to the diaspora since October 7th, is that Israelis are suddenly interested in the diaspora, which was not true in the past. Israelis were Israel-centric. Israel is the center of the Jewish world. And the only time Israelis paid attention to the diaspora is when there was anti-Semitism. Then Israelis felt the need to show solidarity, and and the Israeli media was really a prime culprit. Israelis knew, or still know, next to nothing about American Jewish religious life, diversity, trends, but there is a new interest, and you're seeing it reflected in the Israeli media. Post October 7th, there have been a couple of TV-sponsored films about American Jewry that have come out. There was one excellent 3-part series that was screened on Israeli TV recently that really, for the first time, I think, gave Israelis a very good sweep of the diversity of American Jewry. And so things are changing. And sometimes I worry that we're like the old cliche of two ships passing in the night, that when diaspora Jews were so keenly interested in Israel, we weren't interested. And now when Israelis are keenly interested in diaspora, more and more of the diaspora is turning away, which to me it would be an historic tragedy if the two center points of population center points of the Jewish people today couldn't speak to each other. And I worry about that. That's part of the work I've been doing really for many years. I've been on the Ben Gurion JFK line, speaking in this country for many years as a kind of trying to be a translator of Israel into American, and I'm more worried than I've ever been. I'm worried about two trends that are still on the periphery of either society of Israel and of American Jewry, but are both growing. In Israel, it's the rise of far-right anti-democracy. And in American Jewry, it's the rise of anti-Zionism, Jewish anti-Zionism. And I really do want to emphasize these are still very much minority positions, even fringe positions to some extent. Nevertheless, these positions are growing. And when I think of the two flags on the bima, what they represent in part is the Jewish state and the democratic state. And if you have Israelis turning against the democratic state, and you have American Jews turning against the Jewish state, then there's going to be nothing left in this relationship. So that really worries me. But more deeply, I worry about the fact that we're not going to take advantage of the post-October 7th opportunity. That many American Jews woke up on October 7th and realized that Israel means a lot more to them than maybe they had thought. And that was an important moment. And the question is, what do we do with that? And how do we navigate all of the difficult questions? How do we navigate the question of American Jewish criticism of Israel? How do we deal with the fact that the two communities know almost nothing about each other's culture, about each other's inner life? Israelis know nothing about religious pluralism and have a lot to learn from American Jews. American Jews know almost nothing about Israeli culture, about Israeli music. And I believe that Israeli music is one of the greatest cultural achievements of the Jewish people in the modern world. And yet the diaspora doesn't know its own culture, because those songs don't only belong to me. Those songs are part of the Jewish people. So these are the issues that I worry about, the issues that I work on. That's what we do at Hartman. That's what we spend our time working on. So I think that it's as usual in Jewish life, it's a crisis and an opportunity. So
Yeah. Okay, very nice. Good. So we're going to open up the questions now. My colleagues are going to text me any Zoom questions. My colleague Isaac's going to walk around with a mic if you'll raise your hands. I just encourage you, if you have a statement to make, to save that for dessert. But now just to ask questions. Yeah, this one's good. Ask questions. And yeah, so whoever's hands up, yeah, we can just, whoever's, go ahead. Yeah. It's okay. Go ahead.
Hi. I was just, thank you very much, first of all, for this. This was an amazing dialogue. But my question is, I am going to be staffing a trip to Israel this summer with Honeymoon Israel, where I first met Rabbi Shuli. And the trip was supposed to go last summer. Obviously, we've gotten pushed back. And there's a lot of young couples who are nervous about traveling, and a lot of people I run into who are just nervous in general about traveling to Israel at this time. What would you tell? How do I reassure them that this is also still a good time to go and support?
My job is to repeat the questions. So thank you for that. And we have a guest here who has asked if it's safe to travel to Israel.
it's safe today.
Yeah.
I really, I can't say it's going to be safe tomorrow. That's the best I can do. I think we have to be honest. It's if you're in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, your chances are it's okay. Even when there are missiles falling around Tel Aviv, it's still safe. We have a good protection envelope, but it can be a little scary, certainly for people who don't live with that situation as part of their normal life. So I think that you can say that airlines have resumed travel, and there haven't been, thank God, any fatalities from the missiles falling aimed at Tel Aviv. Most of them don't hit. Is this enough of a reassurance for someone from Arizona? I don't know. It works for Israelis, but I don't know. Honestly, I just don't know what else to say. And I mean, look, I have to tell you, my wife and I moved to Israel in the summer of 1982, which was the beginning of the first Lebanon war. And there were tanks in the streets, and it was just a terrible time. But it was our time to move to Israel. That's when circumstances worked out for us professionally, personally, that the summer of 1982. And we didn't think for a moment of not going. So that's my personal answer, but I can't give that answer to others. I was able to make that decision for myself, but sorry, it's the best I can do.
Thank you. I'm heartened by your comments about what keeps you up at night, and concerned about what keeps me up at night. And that is, you speak of a resurgence of a connection to Judaism and Israel that has been elicited by the events of October 7th. What concerns me is the emergence of an anti-Zionist trend that I perceive in the United States today, both among the Jewish community and in particular in the rabbinic world, where we are now seeing actively anti-Zionist Jews being ordained as rabbis and leading congregations that define themselves as anti-Zionists. And I'm wondering if you can speak at all to that trend and say something that will give me hope.
Okay, Rabbi asked to speak on the trends of emerging Jewish anti-Zionism and even among rabbinical students. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. There was an organization that was formed, I guess about a year ago, something like Zionist Rabbis of America. And the name really depressed me because really, I didn't know. I mean, I knew there were a handful, and I still think it's a relative handful. But you're right, it's growing, and it still shocks me. And what does give me hope, I'll cut to the heart of your question, and then try to say something else about this. But what gives me hope about it is that I deeply believe that those rabbis are an anachronism. They would have made sense in the 1920s when a large part of the reform movement was anti-Zionist. And there was a legitimate debate within the Jewish people over Zionism before there was a state. Does this really make sense? Is this really a good idea to move what turned out to be half the Jewish people into the volcano of the Middle East? There were issues. There were issues that made sense to debate 100 years ago. To debate Zionism within the Jewish community when Israel has succeeded in creating the world's largest Jewish community. To be an anti-Zionist Jew after October 7th means to be willing to place 7 million Jews into the circumstances of an October 7th permanently. If you end Jewish sovereignty and you dismantle the IDF, which is what the position of the anti-Zionists is, then you are talking about leaving 7 million Jews to the mercy of our enemies in the Middle East. That to me is so shocking. And without mentioning names, Peter Beinart wrote in his recent book, whose name I will not say because do not read that book. He was making the case about how Israel will be safe in a post-Zionist Middle East. Israel doesn't really need the 7 million Jews don't need the protection. And I read that and ask myself a very simple question. Does he ever lie in bed at night and ask himself, what if I'm wrong? Maybe given the reality of the Middle East, maybe it won't work out. Maybe it won't be a happy ever after if 7 million Jews are left defenseless in the Middle East, given the fate of other minorities, given the hatred for Israel in the region, etc. And so anti-Zionists generally upset me but anti-Zionist Jews appall me. It's a different level of antipathy that I feel. And it's a sense of such profound betrayal. I don't have an argument with anti-Zionist Jews because we're not speaking the same language. We don't have the most minimal shared commitments. We might as well belong to two different peoples. And now I make a distinction between a kid on campus, a Jewish kid who's been exposed to certain ideas and becomes anti-Zionist. And those kids we have to draw closer, not push away. It's the leadership and the organized expressions of Jewish anti-Zionism that need to be placed far outside the Jewish community in the way that a generation ago, the American Jewish community treated Jews for Jesus. This is worse.
Oh, okay, so we have many questions in the room and many in the Zoom. So I want to just take two from the Zoom. One is your understanding of what constitutes anti-Semitism. What definition is operative in your mind? That's the first. And the second, this has been a period of deep despair, and each day something happens to reinforce that the Jewish community is under attack. How do you avoid just getting caught up in fear? Yeah.
Good question. In terms of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but that was a Freudian slip because I wonder whether the real question is anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism? So you didn't ask that question, but I'll try to answer it. My definition of anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism is the symbolization of the Jews. It's turning the Jew into a symbol of whatever a given society regards as its worst qualities. So under pre-Vatican II Christianity, the Jew was Christ killer. Nothing worse than that for Christian civilization. Under Islam, the Jews were called the killers of prophets. Nothing worse than that for a religion that venerates the prophet. Under Marxism, the Jew was the capitalist. Under Nazism, the Jew was the ultimate race polluter. And now we come to anti-Zionism. In the era of human rights, anti-apartheid, anti-genocide, the Jewish state emerges as the embodiment of all of the qualities that modern enlightened society regards as the most loathsome. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's a pattern here. That's not to say that anyone who's an anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite, but I do believe that anti-Zionists are participating in an anti-Semitic moment. The singling out and unique criminalizing of the Jewish state is an anti-Semitic moment. It fits the pattern of the symbolization of the Jew. And again, that doesn't mean that every anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite. I think that's ridiculous. And it doesn't necessarily mean that anti-Zionism itself as an ideology is inherently anti-Semitic. I don't think it is. But the uses to which it is applied today, in which Israel is uniquely singled out and is turned into the criminal of nations, that is anti-Semitic.
And how not to despair with it.
How not to despair.
Or before overwhelmed by fear.
Right. The fear is a legitimate and unavoidable part of this time, and it is it's instinctive in us. It's part of us, but we know that nothing strong comes out of fear. And that's not to say that we won't be afraid. And, people who've been in war will say, of course you're afraid. Heroism doesn't mean not being afraid. It means overcoming fear. And so this is one of those moments that require of us an heroic act of overcoming fear, not being paralyzed by fear. And Israel certainly proved that capacity on October 8th. And I think we're proving it every day. And American Jews, in the American Jewish community is proving that as well. The fact that American Jews continue to show up in Jewish spaces is an act of heroism. And I was here when the Pittsburgh massacre happened. I was on a lecture tour, and it was profoundly moving to me as I went from city to city, participating in these gatherings, to see the whole Jewish community coming out, and of course many non-Jews as well, and that the reaction to threat is assertiveness, and that's who we are as a people. You asked, how did we survive for thousands of years? Well, by overcoming fear. That's certainly one of the ways.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing, and then we'll take maybe one or two more questions from the crowd. The other courage I see locally and nationally is Jews who continue to stand up for the rights of other minorities and vulnerable people in America. Some people say, get out of those spaces, they don't want you, they're all anti-Semites. But here locally, we have people who continue to show up for racial justice, or for immigrant rights, or for refugees, or to stand up for democracy, or for women's rights, or whoever it is. So we're not going to partner with the anti-Semites, but we can still do that work. And I think that's another sign of the heroism we see in the community, to say that if all we're doing is talking about Jews, we've lost. What are we here to do if we have no message for the world of rights and values? And so I think part of this moment is bringing out a heroism of saying, if we're stuck in fear where we forget what we're about, then what's happened to us?
I was at a Jewish conference recently. Yeah, really. I was at a Jewish conference a couple of weeks ago, and Van Jones spoke. And it was extraordinary. And he said, you came out of the Holocaust better, not bitter. He said, I don't know how you guys did that, but instead of turning away from the world, you were there for those of us who needed you. And he said, don't turn away from us now. He said, I understand the anger and the feelings of betrayal in the Jewish community, and you're right to feel that. He said that. Mm-hmm. He said, but I'm asking you to stay Jewish. He said, we need you to still be Jews. Mm-hmm. Very powerful.
Yeah. But I think the other mistake is that some people thought we were doing that stuff to prevent anti-Semitism. We were doing it because it's Torah. We're standing up for what's right because it's Judaism. And even if people don't like us, we're still going to stand up for what we think is right. So, okay, Isaac, let's take another one, maybe one more comment out here. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. It's been very, very inspiring. But my question is now going back to Israel. I won't mention the name that you don't want to mention. But my question is, how does the rest of the Israelis deal with the idea of the ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox that are not serving in the military, considering the need that we are talking about the diaspora Jews need to come and help, and we are talking about all of those. What are we doing? And not only are they not participating in the military and other things, they are getting some large sums of money. They are cutting the education in Israel. They are doing all of these things. So the religious institutions get the money. And that is an abomination, in my opinion.
Okay, so we have a question about how Israelis are experiencing the ultra-Orthodox. While Israelis are kept up at night with their kids serving in war and ultra-Orthodox are not, how do they experience? And I want to add to that, is there any resentment of diaspora Jews for not sending their children into service as well?
To answer your question, no, it doesn't come up. I've never heard it in any circles. It's interesting question, but no. In terms of the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, I sign on to every word. Abomination is a I think, a pretty sober way of describing the situation. And I have a great deal of affection for the Haredi community, and they're working very hard to take that away from me. So the problem is not the Haredi. The problem is the rest of us in Israel, because we allow it to happen. The Haredim, in Hebrew, the old Hebrew expression, notnim lokchim. If they're offering, take it. Whatever they're offering, just take it. So we offered, the Israeli majority, because the right and the left were playing coalition politics and were trying to woo the ultra-Orthodox into their coalition, and each side upped the ante of the bribe. We did. They didn't do it. They're a minority. They can't do anything without our agreement. So we created this situation. We created this monstrous situation, and we need to undo it. It's going to be very difficult. Excuse me. After decades of creating a normative situation, which one generation after another of Haredim have taken as a given, to suddenly pull the subsidies, and we must pull all the subsidies. From any, we should be subsidizing every Haredi child to the age of 18, any education they want, provided that there is also a core curriculum that will prepare them for the workplace. But certainly, we should fully subsidize Haredi education and see the Haredi as an asset to Israeli society until the age of 18. After the age of 18, I don't know, and I go back and forth. Do we forcibly draft them? Thousands will not go. Do we send them to jail? Maybe. Or do we simply say the subsidies are over? In which case we're going to have an immediate crisis of extreme poverty in the ultra-Orthodox community, and we need to be prepared for that. There are going to be consequences for ending this abnormal relationship, but we have no choice. And one of the things that I'm hopeful about Israel, so let's end on a hopeful note, is that there are seething undercurrents in Haredi society among young people that they're restless, and nobody knows how many. We do know that something like 4,000 young Haredim leave the community every year. It's a drop in the ocean. But if 4,000 have the courage to leave, how many more would leave if circumstances were right? So I'm very hopeful for real upheaval in the Haredi community. And you know what? I don't even want them to leave. Stay in the Haredi community, but your relationship to the state has to change. And so I think I think it will happen. The only question is, will it happen gradually or will it happen traumatically? I suspect we have no choice at this point but to do it sooner than later with all the consequences.
Friends, let's hear it from Mr. Yossi Klein Halevi.